So I mentioned earlier this morning that we really wanted to hear not only from big thinkers about people from across the country, but also local perspectives of people who are doing on-the-ground work in restoration, conservation, science, monitoring. And so we heard from one already. Now we're going to have a session on two more people who are looking at pollinators and how they relate to wood across our landscape or trees. And so the first will be Georgia Lopez from Circle Ecology. And so thanks so much for being here. I'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much. Hello, thank you for letting me be here. I'm very excited to share with you what I've been working with the city of Longmont. And so we'll be diving in. I am an ecologist, and I work toward creating and helping manage and expand long-term monitoring projects like the one I'll be sharing today. The evaluation of B-log hotels was a topic of interest for the city of Longmont under their ecosystem management group. Yeah, I'll just use a keyboard, thanks. So while most of our solitary native bees and wasps nest in the ground, some species have evolved to use holes in wood called secondary nesters. They're called secondary nesters since they use holes that were made by other insects like beetles. Some of these species will use human-made wooden blocks with different size of holes drilled into the wood. Having diverse hole sizes is especially important. Colorado has one of the nation's most diverse bee fauna, with an abundance of solitary wood nesting bees, which make up about 25% of the bees here in the Front Range. With diverse bee fauna also comes diverse nesting needs. These pollinators use various materials, including leaves, mud, resin, and grass. The composition of material used to plug the nest is specific to the type of bee or wasp, and so it provides a way to categorize what nest in these bee hotels. Bee communities are often driven by the availability of nesting substrates. So where wood debris is lacking or must be removed, the addition of managing bee hotels can be an effective conservation tool in providing nest sites for cavity nesters and supports various other insect species. Bee hotels are a great tool for collecting cumulative data on the pollinators in the Front Range. It is also unique in that it allows us to collect data during the bee breeding season when netting bees hasn't begun or has stopped. The tool's costs are also low, and when managed well, these sites with bee hotels can be used to collect long-term data, including population trends, factors that are driving these trends, and solitary bees' fitness. Bee hotels have been used since the 1950s and since have been expanding in their use, from transporting solitary bees like the orchid bees for agricultural purposes. They're currently being used for monitoring solitary bee populations like what I have done and continue to do. So this study evaluated 7 bee-log hotels across 5 sites in Longmont in 2023. The city had initially put out logs at these sites in 2021 and then added newly drilled logs in 2023 before the study began. And that's an important part which I'll explain more as we continue on. Here's a map showing where the bee-log locations are. And the path in blue is the St. Vrain Greenway. So anyone who has been on the St. Vrain Greenway, maybe you've seen these bee logs. Here's a picture showing the log specs of the ones installed in the spring of 2023. So these are the new logs. Each log had 15 holes drilled on each side with a hole size of either an 1/8, a 1/4, or 3/8 inch hole. With this organized pattern, it allowed me to monitor if the bees were nesting in holes and record the different stages of nest development. And as you can see below, the 2021 logs, those are the older logs, and we evaluate those a little bit differently. So that brings me to the objectives. The study's objectives were to assess the effectiveness of these hotels in monitoring, evaluating the use, and providing recommendations for best practices in long-term population monitoring of wood nesting pollinators. Much of the methodology for the study came from the bees' needs, which happened in 2013 through 2016. I collected data every 2 weeks, starting in May through the first week of October. There's 3 categories of data I collected during each site. First was for the newly drilled logs, where I would record the presence of nests, what material used to construct the nest plug, and the stage of completion. Second, I would record any emergence from the 2021 logs, and I'll go more into detail later in the presentation about that. And then third, I would record any blooming flowers and woody debris near the nest sites. Here's a photo sharing with you some bee and wasp occupants observed based on their nesting materials. The photographs displayed 3 distinct nest plug types found in the newly drilled logs. From left to right, the images illustrate nest plugs containing whole leaf pieces, grass blades, and silk, each associated with pollinators within the genre Megachile, Isodontia, and Hylaeus. I got the opportunity to observe this grass-carrying wasp bringing in nesting material. Of course, it decided to plug a nest that I wasn't monitoring, but it was still really amazing to see. I watched this wasp land on the log and back itself into one of the holes at Site 3. This wasp is from the family Crabronidae, which is a very diverse family that includes both ground and secondary nesters. This wasp was observed in an 1/8-inch hole, which can be a helpful identifier for further classification. Here is a mason bee entering a hole. I waited, trying to get a picture of the full bee, but it never came out, so I got the bee behind. However, we know that this is a mason bee based on its metallic green color. The 2023 spring was a rainy, wet spring. So not only did these holes provide nesting sites for females, it also provided shelter for other insects, like what this male leaf-cutting bee is doing here. We know that this is a male based on its orange-brown color and greenish eyes. There were a total of 630 holes to monitor, which means I looked at each of these 630 holes twice a month for 5.5 months, totaling over 6,000 observations in 2023. This leads me to my results. So what did I find after 6,000 observations over the course of the 2023 spring and fall months? Well, of these 630 available holes, 118 of those holes were occupied. Of the total holes, 32 confirmed as bee nest plugs and 14 wasp nest plugs, with the remaining of the cavities being occupied by spider or other occupants, such as pill bugs and ants. We had carder bees, mass bees, leaf-cutting bees, and mason bees. Leaf-cutting bees, whose nests were made of overlapping leaf pieces, was the group with the most occupants in 2023 logs. Of the wasps that were observed, grass-carrying wasps was the group with the most occupants in 2023 logs. So far, I've been focusing a lot of this talk on the newly drilled logs. Part of the reason for having the newly drilled 2023 logs put out was also to be able to compare if the bees preferred older drilled logs versus newly drilled logs. The monitoring results shared that cavity nesting pollinators preferred the 2021 logs over the 2023. I documented 25 completed, meaning fully closed nests from the newly drilled logs. While in comparison with this photo, this is a 2021 log for one side, and it has at least 25 completed nests in it. Notably, given that the active nests become complete nests presumably through time, only a third of the nests in the 2023 logs were fully completed. Of those 2023 completed nests, 2 of the nests were parasitized. This finding suggests that old logs, although may be preferred by the bee community as nesting sites, could harbor parasites that find new hosts in the newer logs. The low detections in the new 2023 logs could be due to a number of factors, driven primarily by there being enough natural nesting sites that they didn't need the logs to nest in, or the pollinators did not like something about the logs, such as they were too wet, too resinous, or too new or shaggy tunnels. The 2021 logs may not have been monitored for the type of insects present, but they were monitored to understand the emergence rate at each site. By documenting the nest plug emergence rate of the older logs can share a lot about the secondary nesters' fitness in our area. This was completed by taking photos of the 2021 log during the initial site visit, using them to count the holes of the 2021 that occupied nest had at the beginning of the project. And then I used Adobe Illustrator to create lines and shapes called vector images. This allowed me to bring these into the field and draw date-specific shapes around the holes that emerged. This is an example of one of those vector images from site 5. You will see at the top I had a total number of plugs counted and colored in at the beginning of May. As the season went on, I would choose a shape for the date and to track which had emerged throughout the bee season. Here shows the percent emergence of the 2021 bee logs for both sides at one of the sites, site 6. Just look how it shows the seasonality changes in nest plug fitness. So showing that in May, 5% was the average, and then as the season went on, it went up to 59%. The average emergence rate across all the sites between the bee breeding season was found to be 79%. It is important to note that these calculations did not take into consideration potential predation, as you can see in this video I took of a velvet ant excavating leaf pieces from an established megachila nest at site 4. So besides understanding if wood nesting bees and wasps would use these logs and what types, I also wanted to explore the relationships and abundance and diversity to the landscape. I did this by surveying for the presence of woody debris and the blooming plant species there within 300 meters of the site's location. This distance was based on the bees' flight distance direct relationship to their bee size. Colorado, with its diverse bee fauna, there's also going to be diversity in flight dependence. So that's why we chose 300 meters to survey. There were 27 blooming plant species within 300-meter radius of the 7 sites, and each site had woody debris present. Many of the plant species were found across all sites. Here is sharing the wood nesting pollinators observed in the 2023 logs to the blooming floral abundance at each site. Woody debris was present at all the sites, indicating the potential for wood nesting pollinators to be using for nesting sites of the bee log hotels. It was pretty incredible just to see those stats. It was only 1 year, but what a difference between the sites there was. The determined value for 2023 logs was also an objective of mine, and this was found to be low. We only saw 25 completed nest plugs in the 2023 logs, and so 1 year of a single season of monitoring was not enough time to give a credible value for these logs, as we could see with the preferred older logs in the 2021 logs. Recommendations included choosing the right location, using a mix of old and new logs, and yearly monitoring to better understand the relationship between wood nesting pollinators, their parasites, and their habitat. Lifting logs at least 1 foot off the ground was a recommendation for limiting predation. Drilling clean holes using sharp drill bits to avoid overly wet or resiny logs. Another recommendation or consideration is to use more size hole options between a 1/4 inch and an 1/8 inch. For example, Herbaceous species prefer small tunnels. Also providing variety of heights for these nesting sites is a consideration. Osmia lignaria prefers nests around 4 feet off the ground, while some Hylaea species nest close to the ground and prefer shaded areas. Nest plugs that have continual high occurrence of parasitism should be retired. Timely contract execution, that is something that came across for me when I was doing this work. And the bee breeding season in Colorado can start as early as March. So it's helpful to have the contract in place so we can get those rarely observed early and late breeding species. And signs. Signage can help share what and why there are logs. I went out to observe one of the bee log hotels and could not find some of the logs. And so I hiked around and I found them over by the pond, assuming people use them as fishing stumps. So signs, again, could be helpful. The study revealed variation in species abundance and diversity across sites, with older logs being preferred over newly drilled logs. A 1/4 inch cavity size was the hole size with most occupants. However, it is important to diversify hole sizes for the diverse bee fauna in Colorado. Some considerations include log placement, elevation, and orientation to provide favorable nest sites for these pollinators. The study provides insight into optimizing their use for conservation monitoring and efforts. Now my favorite slide. Future research directions. There's so much more that we could do with this information that the bees need started for us. For me, I would like to continue to monitor for the city of Longmont. I'm also interested in monitoring across different elevation sites. Continual monitoring will help us to understand wood nesting pollinators as hosts to parasites in their environment. I would like to connect and collaborate with Tribal Cultural Barrier to implement traditional ecological knowledge concepts within this research project. Monitoring snags in forest stands to see what wood nesting bees in our forests before and after forestry work is done for wildfire mitigation. A lot of times in forestry work, they'll go in and take away fuel, selective thinning, and I would like to be part of that conversation to possibly keep some of those snags every 300 meters to provide nest sites for birds, beetles, and these nesting pollinators. Acknowledgements. I couldn't have done this without this wonderful team. Thank you, Virginia Scott, Dr. Adrian Carper, Greg Holman, and Longmont's Ecosystem Management Group. If you're interested in collaborating to continue to expand this work, I'd love to talk with you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Georgia. Do we have any question runners on the sides? If anybody's got questions they want to jot down. I'm looking for our volunteers to grab paper. Or maybe, I think we may be unprepared. Maybe I'll just take a couple real quick, and then I can reiterate the question. How about that?
Do you recommend cleaning out the holes at the end of the season?
Can I reiterate for everybody?
Yes.
So the question was, do you recommend cleaning the holes out at the end of the season?
I would recommend after 3 to 4 years, if you're not monitoring for parasites, I'd recommend retiring them after 3 to 4 years. You can simply put them in a box with holes at the end of the season in October so that the bees that emerge can emerge the next spring, and then you can just retire that.
Yeah, and I'll tack on to that if you have bees in your block, there's no point in time when they're not there. So the adults are filling up the nest block over the spring when they're active, and then their babies are there all year long, so until they emerge the next spring. So really retiring is the way to go. Here's a good question. What about how deep should they be drilling holes?
So it depends on if you're using wood with bark or wood that doesn't have any bark. Without bark, it would be about 4 inches. With bark, it's 5 to 6 inches.
Any last ones floating out there? Got one coming in hot? Yeah, just ask.
My husband drilled dozens of these logs, and we ran out of space on the south side of the house to store them before they were going to be used for workshops. So we put a bunch on the north side of the house, and the bees filled those with, so there were leaf cutters, there were tiny dark bees, carpenter bees, there were mason bees.
Wonderful.
So they obviously didn't care that they were in the shade, and so now the question is, can we leave them where the bees chose to use them, or should we move them to the south side of the house?
Leave them. We have so many diverse bees, and we're still learning what their nesting preferences are. So I would leave them.
Sorry, I was reading everybody else's questions. The question was they had nests out on both the north and south sides of the houses and was curious if they should move them from the north to the south because a lot of people read that's what you're supposed to do.
We did find a little bit of preference to the south-facing logs versus north-facing logs in this study. But again, we're still learning about their nesting preferences. So if you saw them using them on the north side in shade, leave it.
So we've had several questions come in about the actual logs, what they were made of, and if we know anything about preferences between our native bees and different types of tree species.
So the logs that were used for this study were untreated pine logs. I don't know the species. We didn't know the species. But next year we will be using also cottonwood trees as a substrate difference. I have seen in forest ponderosa pines being a favorable type of tree for bees to nest in also.
Also, people asking about the difference between cavity nesting and stem nesting bees. Do you get both? Do you know?
I'll let you answer that one.
So a good question. I've fielded this several times. We do have stem-only nesting bees. Those that don't nest in cavities made by beetles and wood, they prefer pithy stems. They like to chew the insides of the stem out. Think of Sambucus elderberry stems, for instance. It's a very small group of bees which only nest in stems, but they're also ecologically important.
Thank you.
And then here's a question on who was the most abundant. We know it was a megachyle. Was it native?
Well, we didn't ID it to species, but we think it was Megachyle rodontia, and that is an introduced species. But I also want to bring into mind that where these bee log locations were located and how close they were to agricultural uses has a lot to do with that.
Okay, one last one, which was, it's interesting to see the ordered versus unordered plugs. Do you think there's any difference, or could it have an impact on why some were more preferred than others?
I don't know that yet. That's a great question. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that yet.
That's a good question. Was Virginia Scott in here? I would ask her that question.
Yeah, what is
Where
it,
is she?
Virginia? She's
Do you think that has any impact?
Probably not. If they're needing nest sites, they'll nest whether they're in rows or not.
Yeah. I might hypothesize that having a diversity of plugs means that your nests aren't right next to each other. And so if you are worried about things like parasites or parasitoids, then it's harder to find your next host if your nest plug isn't right next door, right? So having them mixed up might be a good thing. Mm-hmm. Just a guess. Awesome. Anything else to add? Thanks so much, Georgia.
Thank
Big
you.
round of applause. All right. Next up, we've got Derek Lowstuter, who's from CSU Extension, to talk about trees for bees.
Yes.
Down advances, and you're welcome to use that or this.
Okay, so down advances?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Oh, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Derek Lowstuter, and I'm with CSU Extension. Oh, no, you're good. My family doesn't even get the name right, so. My position is agriculture and food system specialist, but my background is in forestry. So I always appreciate the opportunity to kind of go back to my metaphorical and literal roots. So some of the things that I would like to talk with you all today about, why specifically trees in the context of pollinators, some examples specifically. I'm not going to promote, one thing really above the other. Some fire-wise choices as we are in a warming climate, and then some tips for bee-friendly planting, so kind of some general ideas. And when I first talk about trees for pollinators, trees for bees, excuse me, a lot of people understandably first think about flowers. So it could be something that's really showy, like a crabapple. It could be something that's a little understated, like a willow catkin, or it could be maple, which is also a significant food source for bees. But really, with this presentation, I kind of want to think outside the flower, some additional benefits that trees and shrubs can provide. So I like thinking of trees and large shrubs or multi-stemmed short-statured trees as planned communities for bees. So they protect bees from flight and bees in flight in high winds. So not only making it more efficient for them to fly, but also making it safer for them to fly. it's a high forage density and seasonality. So by density, I mean you can have, you know, a pollinator planting below the trees, but you can stack your forage source as well. So you are making it a vertical density, not just horizontal density. And then also seasonality. So you can stack in time. If you want to have really a show-stopping, spring-blooming garden for pollinators, you can do that, but it's good to amend that with something else that might flower later in the season, which some trees can fill that role very well. And then also forage continuity. So it's not just the density of the forage resource, it is the continuity of it. So especially if you have clustered plantings of trees and shrubs, you can make that forage source more continuous for the pollinators. And then as we learn more about kind of bee physiology and how they function, trees and shrubs can act as navigational landmarks for bees. They can provide shade in summer, and then also, other side of that, they can provide wind, cold wind and snow protection in winter. And then there's also protected habitat in the understory. So it's not just the food source that we're talking about, it's actually creating habitat for these pollinators like we saw in George's presentation. So extrafloral nectaries, how many people have heard of those before? So a fair number, that's excellent. I figured if I asked that question in a room of people, this would be a good room of people to ask that. So they were first identified in the 1870s, and then they were described as extranuptial nectaries in 1886. So it's meant to set these nectaries apart from flowers, as the name suggests. So it's non-reproductive nectar source, so very scandalous. But they're fairly common, and some of you probably have plants in your yard or even house plants that have these nectaries. They're present in nearly 4,000 plant species, and that, you know, as we learn more, we figure out there's more of them. They're present in nearly half of all flowering plant orders. And it's an interesting case of convergent evolution. So it's not like one common ancestor that all these plants came from. There's multiple instances in the taxonomical framework where this has developed as a beneficial trait for plants. And especially in the first instance that this was identified, extrafloral nectaries are most commonly associated with ants, wasps, and other kind of bodyguard insects that can protect the plant from herbivory. So like one of the best known and described examples is acacia trees. So these really aggressive ants that attacked an animal that might be trying to eat the leaves or browsing on the twigs of that plant. And then, I'm sorry, I noticed that there's a typo in here. It should say quality and quantity are highly variable of these extrafloral nectaries. Oh, I do like the emphasis on quality. So it really depends. Not every extrafloral nectary is the same, like the carbohydrates, the amino acids, other things that might be present. It's going to be different depending upon the plant. So not all extrafloral nectaries are created equal. But Prunus species, Populus species, and Salix are well represented when it comes to these nectaries. And for those of you who didn't previously know about it, you've probably seen them, like I said. So on the left, there's a gland on the base of some cherry. And then on the right, it's the base of the leaf on an ornamental peach. So often these show up, if it's on the leaf, it shows up as a pair of glands, and then you'll notice that secretes a little bit of nectar on it, just like you'd find in a flower. And then sometimes they can be difficult to differentiate because they can show up as just kind of what you might think is an abnormal growth or some dentation on the leaf. But really, like any above ground plant part can have these nectaries in the species that they've been identified in. So it's not just on the leaves. And then, perfect tie-in with George's presentation, also important for woody plant habitat. So some good trees and shrubs for this habitat, Catalpa speciosa, Cercis canadensis, sambucus, and ruse. So Catalpa, redbud, elderberry, and sumac are good because partially those stem nesting bees. And here's just a few pictures of that in action. So a leafcutter bee that's making its, the chambers and that cavity. And then there are some characteristic leafcutter bee damage on those leaf margins of a redbud. And then you can see another little bee butt sticking out of that. I believe it's an elderberry stem. And then how many of you have heard of, the soft landing concept? Again, if I was going to ask that question in a group of people, this is the room to ask that in. So diverse native, I added the ish, native-ish plantings under keystone trees or other regionally appropriate native-ish trees. These safe, undisturbed areas, which also include fallen leaves and organic material, provide the habitat many beneficial insects must have to complete their life cycle. So, of course, not talking just about pollinators, but other beneficial insects as well. I want to do that again. Thank you. So some generally good trees and shrubs for bees. There's a lot out there, and I don't want to discourage anyone from planting something if they don't see it. But these are ones that are well represented in the literature for providing adequate forage, either through flowers or extrafloral nectaries. So again, prunus species, so stone fruits like chokecherry, plum, tilia or linden, willows, apples, maples, horse chestnuts, or Ohio buckeyes, hawthorns, all good trees that generally provide good food and habitat for bees. And then for shorter stature woody plants, we have currants, gooseberries, we have sumac, ninebark, amelanchier is like Saskatoon, serviceberry, juneberry, all those names. And then aronia, dogwood, and then also viburnum can be beneficial as well. And again, not all of these are created equal, but if anything, it's good to have a diversity. And I specifically want to call out linden because I've heard some disparaging remarks regarding linden and its appropriateness for pollinators, specifically regarding bee mortality. So if there's really any tree that I associate with bees, it is usually linden, because if you walk by a linden tree that's in full bloom, you can just hear it buzz. It's like radio static. And it's just completely covered in flowers and actively being used for these bees. But people have been concerned that the quality of the nectar isn't good for bees. It's not as energy dense as it should be, so worried about starvation, or that there's secondary metabolites in the nectar that the tree is producing that might be toxic to bees. But generally, from everything that I could find that was studied, tilia species are still good for bees. And in general, they're better than a lot of other trees. So don't be discouraged from planting linden if that's what you want, if you want to bring in bees into the landscape. Another interesting example that I wanted to bring up, because it's one that people don't often associate with pollinators, maybe other insects, but is oak or Quercus species. So the Colorado hairstreak butterfly is the state insect, and it's reliant on gamble oak. but also it can be an important food source for pollinators. So oak have a really kind of, it's not a showy flower, it's just kind of a catkin that hangs down, and it's wind pollinated primarily. So what's its value for pollinators? Well, if you've ever parked your car under a big oak tree or maybe an elm tree and you come back later and it's covered in sticky stuff, that's your answer. So aphids, especially on particular species, can be an important food source for some pollinators. And specifically, there's some companies that create honey from honeydew. So they don't scrape the leaves and turn it into honey. The bees do it for them, to be clear. But it's supposed to have a more kind of earthy, more of a like maple syrup flavor. I've personally never had it, but if any of you have had it, I'd be interested to hear about your experiences. And then also, I'm not going to go into this topic in too much depth, but I wanted to at least tease some resources that are available to you on this topic. So planning for fire and planning for bees are not mutually exclusive. So you can have landscaping that promotes bee health as well as protects your property from fire. And I bring this up in this kind of forum, which I know is kind of unusual. There's a 50 to 200% increase in area burned estimated by the middle of this century. So this is from the Colorado State Forest Service. And you might be thinking, well, that's not really as relevant to me because I don't live in a densely forested area. But we've learned that doesn't really necessarily protect us or exclude fire from those areas. So 65% of Coloradans live in the wildland-urban interface. So these areas where development and natural spaces mix. And that's why a lot of people move to Colorado. They want to live in these WUIs, these wildland-urban interfaces. And then we saw, especially like in the Marshall Fire, one of the reasons why that was so damaging and so expensive is that it happened within these developments within the wildland-urban interface. And for those of you that aren't aware of like home ignition zones and fire-wise defensible space and things like that, there are a lot of resources from CSU Extension and the Colorado State Forest Service, which is located within Colorado State University, similar to Extension. So I highly encourage you to look at some of those resources if that's a concern you have. And then this is a resource that I wanted you to be aware of anyway. It's not an exhaustive list, but it provides the common and scientific names for a lot of different landscape plants and some important characteristics to consider when you're planning. So, for example, sun requirements, water needs, bloom time, that kind of thing. And the sheet breaks down the plants based on their flammability. So you want a high score. Flammability of 10 is good. Flammability of 1 or 0 is not good. But here are a few examples from that list. Again, I just want to kind of highlight a few that you might be interested in. So crabapple, certainly, very, very notable. Lots of options out there for both the flower color, the form, the fruiting characteristics, whether you want something that's edible only for wildlife, something that's more there for aesthetics and that kind of thing. Cheyenne mock orange, which is a relatively small shrub, has these really brilliant white flowers on it. And then so it's not just the plants that you select, it's how you incorporate those into the landscape. So for fire-wise planning, you want to create at least a minimum of 3 to 5 feet of non-combustible vegetation, free perimeter around structures and decks. And then you want to keep those clear of any material that might dry out and become ignited by an ember that comes flying in. And this principle is for structures as well as trees. So if you want to protect a tree, a specimen tree, or something that's really characteristic, you want to incorporate some of these principles in protecting them from a mortality event from fire. And this is because we want to keep the flame on the ground. Because I will say when there is a fire, not if, but when there is a fire, you want to keep that fire on the ground. You don't want it to torch individual tree canopies and then spread throughout that canopy. You want to keep it on the ground. And if it gets up, you want it to get back into the ground before it spreads. And so if you have any vegetation, whether it's a perennial, annual, or a woody shrub, underneath the tree, you want to have at least 3 times the height of that plant material to the base canopy height of the tree above it. And so that's to allow for that flame length, especially when you get a wind, it's kind of whipping the flame back and forth. You want to have enough of a buffer area to help protect that tree. And one of the reasons why I bring that up in this context is because roughly 70% of North American bees are ground nesting. I don't know how many specifically in Colorado might be ground nesting. Is that about the same for Colorado? Okay. And so these bees prefer either, depending upon the species, a deep litter or mulch or bare mineral soil. So depending upon what your target is. And then a diversity of soil cover is ideal. So bare soil, wood mulch, but then also you can go with relatively fine aggregate. I'm not saying big cobbles or rock mulch, which isn't a mulch in my mind. But sand, squeegee, breeze, and pea gravel can be incorporated into these plantings that can still be bee friendly. And then the area inside a tree's drip line, so from the trunk of the tree out to the edges of the tree, that's the drip line, it's ideal for planting ground nesting habitat. Because if you have bare mineral soil in particular, that's going to be at risk from erosion, whether it's from wind or more likely precipitation, so the raindrops disturbing soil and washing that away. But if you have a tree canopy up above it to intercept it, then you open up the possibility of having uncovered soil underneath the tree that can have these multiple purposes. So you're protecting the tree from fire, but you're also providing habitat as well. And then I just want to close with an example that I like that kind of incorporates a lot of these principles. This was a median outside the horticulture building at CSU, and it was just some mulch and then a couple of bike racks. But what they were able to do is turn it into this really attractive rock and crevice garden that provides a lot of value for pollinators. So again, not only the forage sources, but provides the habitat needs as well, both for the litter nesting species as well as the ground nesting species that are going to be into that bare mineral soil. And then they incorporate an overstory as well, so they do have some mature, or what will be mature trees in that median as well to stack those benefits. And then with just a few minutes, I wanted to give you some of the punches of what I'd like to keep you in mind, for you to keep in mind. So plant natives whenever possible. And if you can't plant a native, or if you just don't want to, if there's something you really like, try to go with a species that has something comparable native. So just not a tree, obviously, but like lupine. There's a lot of non-native lupine available in the nursery trade, but there are native lupine. So if you can, go with something that has a close association with a native relative. And then plant for the site. So you want to plant for the conditions of the site. So planting a really pretty flowering tree that has some great nectar for pollinators isn't going to do anything if it dies after you plant it. So match the plant to the site to maximize that benefit. And then plant for habitat. So not only planting for, again, specifically those flowers, but plant for a little more holistic idea of how these species can provide benefit to pollinators. And then plant for other benefits. So you're more likely to maintain a planting if it's providing multiple benefits. So it can be somewhat abstract for you to say, okay, this is good for pollinators. But if you have multiple reasons for maintaining that, because even if it's perennials, we all know that it still requires maintenance. If we have additional benefits that we're getting, whether it's getting an edible apple, whether it's just the winter interest or the fall interest, if we're planting for multiple reasons, not just pollinators, we're more likely to take care of it, and also we're more likely, when we sell that property or someone else takes ownership of it, that they will continue maintenance of that as well. And I'm not suggesting anyone in this room is stupid, but we've all heard of the KISS principle or the KISS method. Keep it simple, stupid, but keep it diverse, stupid. So not just in how you design your planting, but be diverse in the species that you choose, the genera that you choose, even the family, and then again, kind of going back for plant for multiple benefits and try to maximize the diversity in your planting, and through that you're going to maximize the diversity of the invertebrates that get use of that planting. And with that, I really appreciate your time and attention.
Well, it looks like we're prepared with questions rolling in this time. Here's a good question. Are extrafloral nectaries always there, or are they seasonal, year-round? When are they producing extrafloral nectar?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm not an expert in extrafloral nectaries, but from what I understand, it really depends on the plant. There's some, for example, that they produce nectar on the buds as they're starting to break. So it really depends, and also in like drought conditions, the plants might not produce as much nectar in those extrafloral nectaries.
All right, second question. How do you reconcile soft landings with Firewise recommendations? It's hard to have a soft landing on bare ground.
Yeah, exactly. And I had the same thought, and ultimately you can't. You can have that canopy base height high enough, so if you have enough distance from the underlying vegetation and then the tree above it, you can still follow both principles. Or you can extend it outside the drip line if you really want to. But the reality is that if you are in a highly developed area, it's not necessarily the landscape that's at risk for catching your property on fire. It's the neighboring property if that catches on fire. So really all you're doing is mitigating your risk and trying to make that balance.
Okay, time for the most Colorado pollinator question ever. Male cannabis plants seem to attract bees for pollen. Are there any studies of if they're used or not? I don't know if you have any clue.
I'm not aware of studies. I have heard of people making cannabis honey, certainly, and I've heard it's good.
So here's a good point. Planting near natives for bees makes a lot of sense because pollen can be really similar. But what about for Lepidoptera? So do you know anything about the value, say, of near natives for butterflies or moths? Because they may be much more host specific.
Yeah, especially Lepidoptera species. they can be very, very host specific. So whenever possible, try to plant a native. But in general, like the oaks, planting a gamble oak, or I used to work at a nursery that bred hybrids. So like a Burr Gamble Oak hybrid and things like that try to skirt the fence of the species. And I have heard people of having success, kind of assisted migration through hybridization, along that.
I have a question related to somebody else's, which is it a good thing that all these extrafloral nectaries or homopterans on oak trees attract so many wasps to your neighborhood?
My understanding is the vast majority of them are, quote unquote stingless, or they're parasitizing wasps. Certainly if you have yellow jackets or something like that that's attracted to honeydew or the extrafloral nectaries, you have to take that into consideration. But, even yellow jackets can have their role.
And I'll do one more, which is, do you work with people who are interested in Firewise landscaping or planting trees for biodiversity to help people learn how to do this better?
Yeah, certainly. If people are interested, I serve 13 counties in Extension's mountain region. So especially if you're in those counties, I'd be happy to help you. But regardless, if you're outside those counties and you have some questions, I'd be happy to. Especially community meetings or events. Just last Sunday, I was in Salida giving a Firewise landscaping presentation. So if there's people that are interested in contacting CSU Extension or the State Forest Service, I can facilitate that. Either I can do it, or I can put you in touch with people who can.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Derek.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. I'm trying to keep us on schedule, so we're going to take a short little 10-minute break. If you need a bio break, stretch after lunch, take it. We'll see you back in 10 minutes exactly.